welcome back. Today we're going to look at connecting to SingleStore from C#. You can grab a link to this code repository in the description below. Let's dig in and see how we can connect from C# to SingleStore. There's 3 steps. We need to sign up for a license, we need to create a SingleStore instance, and then we run our program. So sign up. Grab this link in the description below. You fill out this form after you click the link in your email, then you'll land here on the customer portal. Now here in the customer portal, you can choose to run a fully managed cluster or click on software licenses where you can get your free license. I'll grab my free license and I'll set it in place here in the Docker Compose file that allows me to spin up a cluster really easily. This Docker Compose file is set up to not only set the license key right here, but also it will run init.sql on the way up. So I've already started Docker Compose and I have my instance right here. Step 1 is done. Step 2 is done. Perfect. Now with SingleStore set up this way, I can come in here to SingleStore Studio at localhost 8080 and I can get connected to my cluster. Localhost, root, I'll enter the password that I chose in my docker compose.yaml file. So here's my docker compose YAML file. And the password I chose is password here. So let's use that to log in. And I'm ready to go. Here inside SingleStore Studio, we can take a look at our cluster, understand memory and disk usage, understand our databases. If we come into the SQL editor, here I can choose a database and I can run a query. Now as part of Docker Compose, this table was already created and data was inserted, so we see that there's data ready to go. Next up, let's dig into the C#. Here in this program.cs, this is definitely not an enterprise-grade program, but it allows us to flex all of the different things. We will do create, read, update, delete, and we'll get to see all of those processes. Here's a class that just allows us to collect data. And first thing we'll do is set our connection details. Now, if our cluster was running on another machine, or if we needed to set our password, maybe it's running in SingleStore Managed Studio, we could adjust these values to match the details for our cluster. Now, when we run this app, it's going to do all of the things. It's going to do that create, read, update, delete. Let's do that. Okay, we've got our app built, and let's run it and do all of those things. Create, read, update, and delete. Perfect. It all went well. Let's look through the code and see what it did. Okay, first step, we're forming the connection string. Now this connection string is not that different from a connection string in any other database, but this connection string is very specifically linked to MySQL. SingleStore is MySQL compatible in most instances, so we'll use the MySQL.NuGet package. Now that we have our connection string, we'll open it and let's go create a new row. We'll then read a new row. And if we didn't get a message, we'll write not found. If we did get one, then we'll write the details of that row that we read. Now we'll go update it. We'll change the content. And then we'll go read all the rows. So we'll get not only the new row that we added, but also the original row added to the database before. We'll write those details to the console as well. And finally, we'll delete. We'll just pass in our connection and our ID, and we'll delete. Let's take a look at each of those methods. Create. Now in this case, we're just forming SQL inline. We are creating variables so that we don't get SQL injection, but we're going to insert, and then we're going to select the last inserted ID so that we can use that ID in our application. We'll use a command parameter to be able to pass in that value so we won't run into SQL injection concerns. We're going to create a new parameter, set the data type, set its length, and set the value to the content that we passed in. Now we're going to execute this. Now to execute scalar, And as part of doing an execute scalar, we'll only get a single value back. Perfect. That's the primary key that we set. Now in this case, it's an unsigned long, but we'll just return that as a regular long. When we're asked to read one, we'll get passed in a long ID, and again, we'll form a SQL command here. Select star from messages where ID equals @ID. We'll create a new parameter to pass that ID. We'll run that, and we get a standard .NET data reader where we can loop through that content and grab out that object. So let's return that object back to the caller. Read all. In this case, we're going to select all of the details, order by ID, and then while reader.read, we'll go grab a new object every time and add it to our list. We'll return the list out of this read all method. Update, we'll get passed an ID and a string content, and we'll go change the record. Passing in those two parameters to ensure that we're not susceptible to SQL injection, we'll execute non-query, which will return the number of rows that were changed. Delete is very straightforward as well. Delete from messages where ID equals ID. Passing in that parameter to avoid SQL injection, and we'll execute non-query to get that result. So we'll insert a row. We'll read that row back out. We will read all rows. We will delete the row. And now we get a feel for all of the different create, read, update, and delete processes inside SingleStore. Let's run it again and take a look at the output. So we inserted row ID 3. We read one row. That row happened to be 3. Here's our text inserted row, and here's a date. We updated row 3, and then we read them all back out. We see that our row is updated. We've changed that text. And then we delete it, and now that record is gone. Perfect. Grab this code from the link in the description below. Feel free to fork or clone this repository and use this to get started with C# and SingleStore. Thanks for watching.